It was a cold, rainy evening when I first arrived in the small, secluded town of Ravenswood. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, and the sound of raindrops tapping against the car window felt oddly comforting. I had hoped this place would offer me the peace and quiet I desperately needed after everything that had happened. My name is Clara, and I was running, not from a person, but from the weight of my own mistakes. The house I rented was an old, creaky Victorian at the edge of town, surrounded by tall, swaying trees. It was the kind of place people whispered about in ghost stories, but I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do with my life now that everything I had built had crumbled beneath me. As I unpacked my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was irrational, I told myself. The house was old and every little creak echoed through its empty halls. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. The next morning, the rain had stopped, and sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. I decided to explore the town. Ravenswood was small, with narrow cobblestone streets and a handful of shops and cafes. The people were polite but distant, their eyes lingering on me just a little too long as I passed by. I could feel their curiosity, their unspoken questions about who I was and why I had come here. At the local bookstore I met him, Elliot. He was tall and lean with dark, tousled hair and a quiet intensity in his eyes that made it hard to look away. He was standing by a shelf, flipping through an old book, when I accidentally bumped into him. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said quickly, stepping back. He looked up, his lips curving into a small smile. "No harm done. New in town?" I nodded. "Just moved here yesterday. Clara, right? You rented the old house on Willow Lane." His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that made me pause. "How did you?" "Small town," he said with a shrug. "Word travels fast." I smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. He seemed friendly enough, but there was an edge to him I couldn't quite place. Before I could say anything else, he handed me the book he was holding. "You might like this," he said. "It's about starting over." I glanced at the title, The Art of Letting Go. It felt too on the nose, but I took it anyway. "Thanks. See you around, Clara," he said, walking past me and out the door. I watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Over the next few days I settled into a routine. Mornings were spent walking through the forest behind the house, afternoons exploring the town, and evenings curled up with a book by the fireplace. It was peaceful, but the sense of being watched never quite went away. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I wasn't so sure. One night as I was washing dishes, I heard a noise outside. A soft rustling like footsteps on the gravel driveway. My heart raced as I turned off the faucet and peered out the window. The yard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered. But the feeling lingered. The next day, I ran into Elliot again, this time at the coffee shop. He was sitting alone at a corner table, a notebook open in front of him. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, surprising myself. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please." We talked for a while, mostly about the town and its history. He told me about the old legends of Ravenswood, stories of ghosts and secrets buried beneath the surface. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic, and I found myself hanging on every word. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "people come to Ravenswood for all kinds of reasons. Some are looking for a fresh start. Others are running from something." I froze, his words hitting a little too close to home. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "Just a feeling." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "Well, you're wrong. I'm just here for the peace and quiet." "Of course," he said, his lips curving into that same small smile. "But if you ever need someone to talk to." "Thanks," I said quickly, standing up. "I should get going." As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time, I wondered if coming to Ravenswood had been a mistake. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, the shadows too dark. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, the rustling outside. This time it was louder, closer. My heart pounded as I got out of bed and crept to the window. There was nothing there. But as I turned to go back to bed, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the tree line. It was Elliot. And he was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The dim light from the moon filtered through the trees, and though I couldn't make out his face clearly, I knew it was him. Elliot. He stood motionless, his figure blending into the shadows of the forest. But his presence was unmistakable. My heart raced as I stepped back from the window, unsure of what to do. Why was he here? What did he want? I waited for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen him. But when I finally mustered the courage to peek out again, he was gone. The yard was empty, the woods silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something about Elliot had unsettled me from the start, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more than just a curious stranger. The next morning, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I went about my usual routine: coffee, a walk through the woods, and a trip to the market. But everywhere I went, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time I turned around, I expected to see Elliot standing there, his dark eyes fixed on me. By the time I got home, I was exhausted both physically and mentally. I locked the doors and drew the curtains, determined to keep the outside world at bay. But as night fell, the unease returned. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside. This time they were closer, deliberate, as if someone was circling the house. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone and crept to the window. I peeked through the curtains, my fingers trembling. There was no one there. But then the footsteps stopped, and a soft knock echoed through the silence. It came from the front door. I froze, my mind racing. Who would come here in the middle of the night? My first thought was Elliot, but I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was a neighbor, or someone who had gotten lost. Maybe. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told me not to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to see outside. There was no one there. I stepped onto the porch, my eyes scanning the yard. The night was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something on the ground. A small envelope, tucked neatly against the doorframe. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded in half. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 4 words. "You're not alone, Clara." I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. Who had left this? How did they know my name? I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the yard was empty. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and double-checked all the windows. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was it Elliot? One of the townspeople? Or someone else entirely? I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent my heart racing. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but determined to get answers. I decided to confront Elliot. If he had been outside my house, he needed to explain himself. I found him at the coffee shop, sitting at his usual table by the window. He looked up as I approached, his expression calm, almost amused. "Clara," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "What a surprise. Were you at my house last night?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Why would I be at your house?" "I saw you," I said, my hands clenched into fists. "You were standing at the edge of the woods watching me." He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Are you sure it was me?" I hesitated, his calm demeanor making me doubt myself. I think it was you." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Clara, if I wanted to see you, I wouldn't skulk around in the woods. I'd knock on your door." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something about the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so confident, that left me speechless. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone softening. "You seem tense." I wanted to tell him about the note, about the footsteps and the knock on my door. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me. Or maybe it was the fear that he already knew. "I'm fine," I said finally. "I just thought I saw something." "Well," he said, leaning back again, "if you ever need help, you know where to find me." I left the coffee shop feeling more confused than ever. If it wasn't Elliot, then who had been outside my house? And why had they left that note? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself with books and chores, but the unease lingered. By the time night fell, I was on edge, every sound setting my nerves on fire. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate, as if whoever was outside wanted me to hear them. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the light into the yard, my hands trembling. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the gravel driveway. For a moment everything was still. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It wasn't Elliot. It was someone else. The flashlight trembled in my hand as the figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't standing still this time. It was moving slowly and deliberately toward the house. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the details. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and its movements were unnervingly calm, as if it had all the time in the world. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. The figure stopped just at the edge of the yard, where the light from my flashlight barely reached. I could see the faint outline of a face, but it was obscured by the hood of a jacket. For a moment we just stood there, me frozen in place, and them staring back at me, unmoving. "Go away," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Still no response. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. I stayed at the window for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever it was had gone, but the fear lingered, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. I double-checked all the locks again, then sat by the fireplace, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Sleep was out of the question. By morning I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone left a note and stood in my yard? That I thought I saw Elliot in the woods? It all sounded ridiculous. Instead, I decided to go back to the bookstore. If anyone in this town knew something, it would be the people who had lived here their whole lives. Plus, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot was somehow connected to all of this, even if I couldn't prove it. When I arrived, the shop was quiet, the smell of old paper and wood polish thick in the air. The owner, a woman named Margaret, was behind the counter, sorting through a stack of books. She looked up as I entered, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Morning," she said curtly. "You're the new girl, aren't you? Clara." I nodded, surprised that she knew my name. "Yeah, that's me. Small town," she said with a shrug, echoing Elliot's words from before. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. I was just wondering, has anything strange ever happened in Ravenswood? You know, like unusual things. Margaret's expression didn't change, but I noticed the way her hands stilled, resting on the stack of books. Strange how, like people watching you, or leaving notes. I glanced around the shop, lowering my voice. Or standing outside your house in the middle of the night. For a moment she didn't respond. Then with a sigh, she leaned on the counter and fixed me with a piercing stare. "Listen, Clara. Ravenswood's an old town, and old towns have their secrets. But if you're asking me if there's something you should be worried about," she paused, her gaze flickering to the window, "I'd say trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Do you know anyone who might? I don't know, follow people around? Or leave notes?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been here a long time, and I've seen a lot of things. But if you're asking about Elliot," she trailed off, her expression unreadable. "What about him?" I asked quickly. She hesitated, then shook her head. Elliot's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly. But people like him, they carry things with them. Old wounds, old ghosts. You do well to keep your distance. I wanted to ask more. But the bell above the door jingled, and a customer walked in. Margaret straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place. Take care of yourself, Clara, she said quietly before turning her attention to the new arrival. I left the bookstore feeling more confused than ever. Margaret's warning about Elliot only added to my unease. What did she mean by old ghosts? And why did she seem so reluctant to talk about him? As I walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the streets were empty, but the sensation clung to me like a shadow. By the time I got home, I was jumpy and on edge. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. But as night fell, the dread returned. I locked all the doors and windows, then sat in the living room with the flashlight and my phone within arm's reach. Hours passed in tense silence, and just when I thought maybe I'd get through the night without incident, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the house. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. This time, I didn't bother calling out. I just shone the light into the yard, my hands trembling. The figure was back. But this time they weren't alone. There were two of them now, both standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. My stomach twisted as I realized they were staring directly at me. One of them raised a hand and pointed toward the house, a slow, deliberate motion that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? My phone was in my hand before I even realized it, and I dialed 911, my fingers shaking. The operator's voice was calm and steady. 911, what's your emergency? There are people outside my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They're just standing there watching me. Are they trying to get inside? No, but... I stopped, glancing back at the window. The figures were gone. Ma'am, the operator prompted. They're gone, I said, my voice shaking. They were there, I swear. Two of them, standing at the edge of the woods. We'll send someone to check the area, the operator said. Stay inside, keep your doors locked, and call us if anything else happens. I hung up and sat on the couch, my heart pounding. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the figures didn't return. When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. They assured me it was probably just kids playing a prank, but their words did little to calm my nerves. As they drove away, I stood at the window, staring out into the darkness. The woods loomed in the distance, their shadows deep and impenetrable. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And then I saw it. Another envelope, lying on the porch. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it and tore it open, my hands trembling. Inside was another note, written in the same neat handwriting. You can't hide forever. I stood there on the porch, the note clutched in my trembling hands, my mind racing. The words echoed in my head like a sinister chant. You can't hide forever. My first instinct was to run back inside, lock the door, and never come out again. But something stopped me, anger. Whoever was doing this wanted me to feel afraid, powerless. And I hated that they were succeeding. I scanned the yard, my eyes darting between the trees, the driveway, the shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. But there was no one there. The woods were silent, as if holding their breath, waiting for me to make a move. I crumpled the note in my hand and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and frustration. Who were these people? What did they want from me? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that Elliot was somehow tied to all of this? I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist into something menacing. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but determined to get answers. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next note, the next knock, the next pair of eyes watching me from the woods. The first thing I did was drive straight to the police station. The officer at the front desk was polite but dismissive, his tone laced with thinly veiled skepticism as I explained what had been happening. Ma'am, like we said last night, it's probably just some kids messing around, he said, leaning back in his chair. Happens all the time in small towns like this. These aren't just pranks, I insisted, my voice rising. Someone is following me, leaving notes, watching my house. This isn't normal. The officer sighed, his expression softening slightly. Look, I'll file a report, okay? We'll keep an eye out. But unless you've got a name or some kind of proof, there's not much we can do. I wanted to scream. Proof? What more proof did they need? But I knew arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. I thanked him through gritted teeth and left, feeling more alone than ever. As I stepped outside, I spotted Elliot across the street, leaning against the wall of a cafe. He was watching me, his dark eyes unreadable. For a moment, I considered confronting him right then and there, demanding to know what he knew. But something about the way he looked at me, calm, almost amused, made me hesitate. Instead, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit Margaret again. She seemed to know more about Ravenswood and its people than she was letting on, and I needed answers. When I arrived at the bookstore, it was empty except for her, sitting behind the counter with a cup of tea. Back so soon? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I need to know the truth, I said, skipping the pleasantries. About this town. About Elliot. About whoever's been leaving these notes. Margaret's expression darkened. She set her tea down and gestured for me to sit. I told you before, Clara. Ravenswood has its secrets. And some of them are better left alone. I don't have that luxury, I snapped. Someone is stalking me, Margaret. They've been outside my house watching me, leaving messages. Last night, there were 2 of them. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. 2. Yes, I said, leaning forward. And they're not going to stop. So if you know something, anything, you need to tell me. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples as if debating whether or not to speak. Finally, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. There are stories about Ravenswood. Stories that go back generations. About people who disappear. About things that happen in the woods. What kind of things? I asked, my voice barely audible. People say the woods are cursed, she continued, her eyes darting toward the window, as if she was afraid someone might overhear. That there's something out there, something that watches, that waits. And those who wander too far, they don't come back. I stared at her, my skin crawling. You can't seriously believe that. I don't know what I believe, she admitted. But I do know this. The people in this town don't talk about it. They pretend it's just old folklore. Something to scare kids into staying out of the woods. But deep down they know. They've always known. I sat back, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded insane, like something out of a horror movie. But then again, so did everything that had been happening to me. What about Elliot? I asked finally. How does he fit into all of this? Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Elliot's family has lived here for generations. They've always been different, quiet, reserved. People say they're connected to the woods somehow, but no one really knows for sure. Connected how? I pressed. She shook her head. I don't know. And I'm not sure I want to know. But if I were you, Clara, I'd stay away from him. Whatever's happening to you. He might be part of it. I left the bookstore feeling more confused and unsettled than ever. Margaret's warnings echoed in my mind as I drove back to the house, the trees lining the road seeming to close in around me. The idea of the woods being cursed was absurd, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the strange pull they seemed to have. Every time I looked at them, I felt like they were watching me, alive in a way I couldn't explain. By the time I got home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I locked the doors and windows again, then sat by the fireplace, staring at the crumpled note on the coffee table. You can't hide forever. What did they want from me? Why were they doing this? As the hours passed, the familiar dread began to creep in. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to shift and move. And then, just as I was starting to think I might make it through the night without incident, I heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just a single deliberate knock. My heart stopped as I stared at the door, my mind racing. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home. But I knew that wouldn't stop them. It never did. Grabbing the flashlight, I crept toward the door, my footsteps silent on the wooden floor. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear anything on the other side. "Clara," a voice said softly, almost a whisper. I froze. It was Elliot. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Let me in," he said. "We need to talk." I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. But something in his voice stopped me. He didn't sound threatening, he sounded desperate. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. Elliot stood on the porch, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're in danger," he said, his voice low. "They're coming for you." "Who?" I demanded. "Who's coming for me?" He glanced over his shoulder, his expression tense. "I don't have time to explain. You need to leave. Now." Before I could respond, a sound came from the woods, a low guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. Elliot's eyes widened, and he grabbed my arm. "Clara," he said urgently. "Run." Elliot's eyes widened as the growl echoed through the still night air, low and menacing, like something primal and inhuman. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The sound didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, darker, almost as if the woods themselves were alive and angry. "Clara," Elliot said urgently, his voice low but firm. "We don't have time. You need to trust me. Grab what you can and leave. Now." I stared at him, torn between fear and disbelief. "What are you talking about? What's out there? Why are they after me?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not just you. It's the house, the woods, everything here. You shouldn't have come to Ravenswood. You've stirred something up. Something that's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the woods, his body tense, his eyes scanning the shadows. The growling grew louder, closer. And I realized with a sickening jolt that whatever was out there wasn't going to wait for me to figure things out. "Clara, please," Elliot said, his voice breaking slightly. "If you stay, you'll die." Something in his tone broke through my paralysis. I nodded, my hands shaking as I stepped back into the house. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and the flashlight, my mind racing. My heart pounded in my chest as I stuffed a few essentials into a bag. But a part of me couldn't stop asking questions. What was happening? Why was this happening to me? Elliot was still on the porch when I returned, his eyes darting nervously toward the woods. "We'll take my car," he said, gesturing toward the darkened driveway. "Yours won't make it far enough." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me not to trust him. But as the growling turned into a low, guttural howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us, I realized I didn't have a choice. Whatever was out there was coming, and I wasn't going to survive this alone. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's go." We sped down the narrow road that led out of Ravenswood, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the trees loomed on either side. The car's engine roared as Elliot pushed it to its limits, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the flashlight like it was some kind of talisman, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. "There's a place outside of town," Elliot said, his eyes fixed on the road. "A safe place. They can't follow us there." "Who are they?" I demanded, my fear quickly turning into frustration. "What's happening, Elliot?" I deserved to know. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's the woods," he said finally. "They're alive. In a way. They've been here longer than the town, longer than any of us. And they don't like outsiders." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "The woods? You're saying the woods are doing this?" "Not just the woods," he said, glancing at me briefly. "There's something in them. Something old. And it doesn't like to be disturbed." I shook my head. disbelief warring with the fear that had taken root in my chest. That doesn't make any sense. Why me? I didn't do anything. You came here, Elliot said simply. That was enough. Before I could respond, the car jolted violently, as if something had slammed into it from the side. I screamed, clutching the door as Elliot fought to keep the car on the road. The tires screeched, and for a moment I thought we were going to crash. But Elliot managed to regain control, his face pale and tense. They're here, he said grimly, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as I saw them. Two figures running alongside the car, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. They weren't human. Their shapes were wrong, shifting and twisting in the darkness like shadows come to life. Their eyes glowed faintly like embers in the night. What the hell are those? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Keep your head down, Elliot ordered, his voice sharp. Don't look at them. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figures were gaining on us, their long, spindly limbs moving in ways that defied logic. One of them reached out its hand, or what passed for a hand, scraping against the side of the car with a sound that made my skin crawl. Elliot! I shouted, panic rising in my chest. I know, he snapped, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring as we sped down the winding road. But the figures didn't slow. If anything, they seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, one of them leapt onto the hood of the car, its glowing eyes staring directly at me through the windshield. Its face, or what was left of it, was a grotesque mask of darkness and decay, its features shifting and melting like smoke. I screamed, scrambling back in my seat as Elliot swerved violently, trying to shake it off. Hold on, he shouted. The car veered sharply to the left, and the creature slid off the hood, disappearing into the shadows. But the other one was still there, its glowing eyes fixed on us as it ran alongside the car. I could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Elliot, we can't outrun them, I cried. We don't have to, he said through gritted teeth. We're almost there. I didn't know what he meant, but I clung to his words like a lifeline. The car sped down the road, the trees blurring together in a dark, oppressive wall. And then suddenly, the woods opened up, and we were driving into a clearing. The change was immediate. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. The figures stopped at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes watching us with a hatred that was almost tangible. But they didn't follow. They couldn't. Elliot brought the car to a screeching halt, his hands still gripping the wheel tightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and my ragged breathing. What just happened? I managed to say, my voice shaking. We're safe, Elliot said, his voice low. For now. I looked around the clearing, my heart still racing. It was quiet, peaceful even, but the memory of those creatures was burned into my mind. Where are we? A sanctuary, Elliot said, finally letting go of the wheel. There aren't many left. But this is one of them. They can't come here. I stared at him, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. What were those things? What do they want? They're part of the woods, he said simply. They protect it, and they destroy anything, or anyone that threatens it. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't threaten anything. I just wanted to start over. I just wanted to be left alone. Elliot looked at me, his expression unreadable. Sometimes it doesn't matter what we want. Sometimes the past follows us no matter where we go. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't have the strength to ask. All I knew was that I was alive for now. But as I looked back toward the woods, their dark shapes looming in the distance, I realized that this wasn't over. Not yet. And maybe not ever.